Today's episode of the podcast is brought to you by Coach Me Plus. Coach Me Plus is the leader in athlete management software and a product that we've been lucky enough to implement here for over 2 years now. The product in and of itself is exactly what you need it to be, guys, with options ranging from being a workout provider, as in sending the workout directly to the student athletes' phones, to being a place where you can communicate with them and bring together multiple streams of data to be its own dashboard for you, your coaching staff, or the athletes. Or you can use what we've added to our menu of Coach Me Plus activities, and that's the hydration station, where all of this information that is provided is based off of research from the Corey Stringer Institute, where we're looking at weighing in versus weighing out and then providing optimal hydration strategies for the student athletes by them selecting through the menu and tapping on what they'll take home with them and what they're consuming prior to the next practice when all the numbers at the top are lined up green. It's something we've had really good success with and the kids have really bought in on. Just another great example of the awesome product that you can find at CoachMePlus.com. Guys, hop over to CoachMePlus.com today and check it out. It's a product I guarantee you won't be disappointed with. Hey everybody, if you enjoy the podcast and the content it provides, be sure to hop over and check out the community. The community is an exclusive members website that is just an extension of what we do here in July at the Central Virginia Sport Performance Seminar. What it is a combination of video lectures, a coach's corner with your Monday morning take-home information, and a forum where you can talk about anything and everything related to the field of strength and conditioning. In the community, you'll find content added each month from some of the top practitioners in the world, ranging from PhDs to high-level coaches, bringing you exactly what they're doing with their athletes or their research at the present moment. On top of that, an additional discussion by coaches bringing you that Monday morning information, things that you can add to your training program right away. Tying that in with the opportunity to discuss with coaches around the world in the forum on anything and everything from the topics addressed in these presentations to whatever you're seeing in your daily life as a coach. If this sounds like the right thing for you and your staff, go ahead and hop over to cvasps.com/community and try it out for 48 hours for just $1. If you like it, you're signed up, ready to roll, and you're jumping into all the great content added each month. If not, feel free to go ahead and cancel at any time. No questions asked. We're really excited about what we're building in the community and hope you are too. Go ahead and hop over to cvasps.com/community and check it out today. Hello and welcome to the podcast. Today, guys, I have the absolute pleasure of sitting down and discussing readiness, preparedness, and sport mastery with Val Nasedkin. Guys, after we catch up a little bit and see what Val's been up to since we last saw him at the seminar, we're going to get right into it. And, Val's going to discuss the differences between them and why it matters. And this actually leads him into talking about what actually makes up an athlete's preparedness. And then he starts talking about where this idea of readiness came from. He breaks down the physiological factors that make up readiness and then how sport mastery fits in. When we finish off talking about functional systems and how looking at that can really change how we train our athletes if we break down the systems that are necessary for their improvement and really look to develop those and how we develop those. This is really an awesome talk, guys. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Let's get right to it. Val, thanks so much for being on with us today, bud.
Thanks, Jay.
Hey,
Good to be here.
Listen, man, excited to have you here. Let's get people caught up. What's the latest with Val? What's he up to now? I know you're back in the States, so let's catch people up here real quick.
Well, yeah, it's nice to be back in the States. Spent approximately 4 years in Finland, where primary objective was to create new products. So hopefully those like Coach Plus, mobile units. That's what have been achieved over the past 4 years. Unfortunately, that also put lots of restrictions on the amount of time I worked directly with teams or individual athletes, as we were too busy trying to solve our technology solution problems. So, but being back in States, I hope that will kind of open up again those opportunities to work directly with people and helping coaches and organizations. Of course, the hard part is now I need to test if I even remember anything, because after 4 years of not doing anything, I might forgot everything already.
Yeah, well, I'm pretty sure that that's not the case.
Well, we'll find out, will we?
Yeah, no doubt, buddy, no doubt. Well, listen, I think one thing when it comes to conversations that you have with people, there's two phrases or two key terms that I still think a lot of coaches interchange, and that's preparedness and readiness. And I think that that would be a good spot for us to start going with is what are the differences? What are they, I guess, first? And then what are the differences and why are people confusing them?
Yeah. Well, actually, I will probably start by talking about how I came to that conclusion. Because to be honest, if it's existed before we start doing all these experiments, I was not aware of it. And the way it came to me to even separate those two things was when we start using our first product that was created. And of course, before that, I coached as everybody else, means classic periodization or block training, you name it. And there, in particular, in classic literature, the readiness and preparedness was all in the same. So there was no distinguishing differences between those terms. In some languages, in fact, it's still the same. They can't even translate it because it's appear to be the similar term. So what happened initially was uh, when we start getting physiological data back and respond to every workout, that data showed significant fluctuation from the baseline, right? And that fluctuation from the baseline lasted for hours, days, and in many cases, weeks. At the same time, the performance level of athletes didn't change, right? So, for example, they were able to produce exactly the same type of exertion while their physiological state was changing quite rapidly. Sometimes they were more tired, sometimes less tired. And so that's what first time kind of made me think about there has to be explanation for this constantly changing physiological state, because it doesn't in the short term, in the acute form, it doesn't affect ability of the athletes to perform. For example, if I test resistance kind of test or sprint test, or so these physiological changes didn't affect it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So then we start talking about, okay, so we probably should separate the current functional state of the athlete, like whatever it is right now at this moment, from overall functional state, right? Because your performance parameters, markers, can continue to improve while your physiological data can show you higher and higher accumulation of fatigue. So that was a kind of a first parameters to try to understand why is it happening and how physiology doesn't linear match the ability of the person to perform. And then, of course, later realization came that it's not even just about physiology. So now let's start talking about the definition and changes. That was the initial problem that we tried to solve. And then there's actually one more parameter that you didn't describe. It's sports mastery.
Mm-hmm.
I think we did talk about it. So in reality, when we want to discuss overall athlete, we need to discuss mastery, then preparedness, and then the readiness, right? So
Yes.
let's start with preparedness. Then we will discuss readiness, and then we will summarize it all into what is the sport mastery. So why is it important? So if we talk about preparedness, we're talking about multi-facet kind of cumulative state of an athlete, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this multi-facet state will include all the components of athlete development. First, of course, it will be skill, sport-specific skill, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is your skill part of preparedness? Of course. The higher prepared you are as an athlete, the better skill you have. Don't confuse skill and sport mastery. So, for example, skill, I can relate it, for example, if I'm a basketball player, I can dribble, or soccer player, right? I can do all kind of tricks with my feet and so on. It's not sport mastery yet. It's just pure biomechanical precision of movement, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that would be skill preparedness. Then, of course, but having a good skill is not enough, because now you have to execute this skill with within certain parameters of intensities, volumes. You have to be able to play on a level, let's say if we talked about Champions League soccer, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's not enough to have a good skill. It's absolutely crucial that you can display this skill over a prolonged period of time, 90 minutes or more, with high precision. Therefore, the second parameter of preparedness would be physical preparedness, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you have to be physically prepared to execute your skill. But that's not enough as well, because you have to function within tactical constraints of your team, because you're not going to be a great contribution to team if you don't function within their strategy, right?
Right.
So the other parameter of preparedness then would be tactical.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to be able to execute and understand the concept of tactical applications of your team. So, of course, in itself, we know many cases where you can be a great tactical player, you can be very well physically developed, you have a good skill, and then you choke out because of importance of the match, or because team relying on you to, score a goal or something like that. That's where the psychological component of preparedness step in. So you have to be also psychologically prepared to deal with all the stressors of the game and so on. So as I said before, preparedness is multifaceted kind of state, right?
Right. Yes, sir.
So, and normally to achieve the level of preparedness, we have to spend, it's a long-term adaptations, of course, right? So it's a long-term process to achieve optimal preparedness. That's what happens. So, and normally in a sport environment, there is different professionals that are responsible for different components of preparedness, right?
Right.
So psychologists may work on your psychological state, conditioning coaches working on your physiological preparedness, tactical coaches work on your tactical preparedness, but altogether makes you the athlete that you are. And normally, any breakdown in any of those components decreases your value as athlete, or decreases your probability of a successful sport career. So ideally, if all of those components are taken care of. Now, so we agreed that preparedness, it's a long-term cumulative state, right?
Yes.
Of all kind of components. But then what confused me, that's what I was, where I started this conversation. What confused me in the time, if that's the case, how come I see such a huge fluctuations in physiological state when we were monitoring on a daily basis responses of different athletes to training? And in some cases, these physiological responses led to decreased performance, even acute responses. In some cases, they did not. So that's where we came to a conclusion it has to be separated. So the overall preparedness is clear. I already explained it. But overall preparedness cannot explain us why some very successful athlete or very successful team can perform very well today and very poorly 2 days down the road. So if we agree that all preparedness components are long-term, right, adaptations, and long-term adaptations that already wired into your nervous system, in your muscular system, they don't just go away.
Right.
It doesn't change overnight. So then what is the reason that you can perform very well one day and very poorly a week from now or even a couple days from now? And that's where we realize it normally happens because acute, not long-term, not chronic changes, but acute changes happen in the body, physiological changes. Unlike preparedness that is multifaceted, readiness is primary physiological, right? And readiness can be described as a current functional state of the biological system, right?
Right.
So in our case, I always said that readiness is purely psychophysiological. It doesn't matter how well you prepared. Let's say I'm in the best state of preparedness. If I'm worried too much about tomorrow's game and I can't get rid of the thoughts about stress of performance and I don't sleep well all night, my preparedness level didn't change. It cannot change that rapidly. But the fatigue that I induced on my, for example, nervous system by not sleeping, by worrying too much, it's such that this change in central or in nervous system will affect my ability to reach my level of preparedness. In other words, we can also call readiness, to some degree, it's similar to fatigue, right? Changes in readiness. So if I'm in the best state of my life, I'm very well prepared, and I just go ahead and I fly around the world, cross many time zones, my preparedness doesn't change. I didn't just suddenly forgot how to play. My physiology did change though. And now, because changes in my physiology, the biological cost of everything I do increases rapidly, right?
Right.
So I'm going into the game, I'm start playing, and very quickly the fatigue sets in, and suddenly, because not optimal function of my primary biological systems that support my performance changes, and suddenly I can't display my skill because when you are sucking air and you're fatigued, doesn't matter what skill you have, it will start breaking down. The physical fatigue will also affect your ability to process information properly if you are in the game, right? So it's somewhat easier with marathon runners because the task is very simple, it's repetitive, and it's stride from stride, it changes very little. But when you have to deal with constantly arising new situation on the pitch, field, court, right, like in tennis, you have to be able to process all of this information that happening around you and figure out the best optimal reciprocal action to that condition. And that ability, because of your purely psychophysiological readiness decrease, will be inhibited. So suddenly, even if you are a greatly prepared athlete, you might not be able to execute your given preparedness level, right?
Yes.
I don't know if it makes sense what I'm saying.
No, 100%.
So let's again, primary differences. Preparedness, it's a state of multiple components. It's basically level of your skill, level of your physical preparation, level of your psychological preparation, tactical preparation, and all of the above. Readiness is basically purely psychophysiologically, and it's basically baseline that will determine how well you can display your preparedness.
Right.
Now, said that, let's not confuse preparedness and mastery, because there's, as I said, another component that is normally we don't talk about it because it's much harder to measure other than the sport performance itself. A good example will be, and I've known many players like that going through academies. So you can have incredible skill of dribble, whatever, right? You can have incredible shot where you can hit the basket if it's basketball every time in a practice or when you just shoot in baskets. You can have a great physiological outcome. You can jump, you can run, you understand the tactics. But the real mastery is not, of course, all of that is component of it, but the real mastery is ability of the people to process information about the game and end up in the right place in the right time. And I've seen some incredible athletes with incredible mastery that actually haven't been properly physically developed or have even good skill for that matter. I remember I was working with, back in my Soviet days, I was working with within the club. It was in Kharkiv, the city in Ukraine, and we had a football club that was in Premiership League of Soviet Union. And there was one football player that was probably a good 6'6" or so. Very clunky, could not run for the life of you, could not dribble the ball the way other players did. But one year in particular, he was the best scorer in the all of Soviet Union league. Even though ball bounced off him like from the wall, he couldn't control it. It's always bounced in the goals. So he was always in the right place and always in the right time, and ball would just bounce off him right in the goals. So that's mastery, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's his ability to make proper decisions at the right times, processing multiple channels of information coming to his nervous system, and making right decision what to do about based on that information. That's a true mastery.
Interesting. Okay, so let's take a step back really quick. When we're talking about the physiological readiness of the athlete, I think it would be good if we touch upon what those biological systems you're actually referring to are, because I think that there are times where people maybe misinterpret some things and look at it as there is different things that really are more powerful than others. But and I think that that's, I don't know if I would necessarily say that's a mistake or that that's maybe just like minor confusion. But maybe if you break down here quick, what actually makes up the level of readiness for the athlete?
Well, you actually quite properly said. Some people think some things more important, other people think other things more important. In reality, it's true. And for that, we need to understand the concept of functional systems. So, for example, when we talk about functional system of marathon runner, what is the primary component of marathon running? So what is the primary system versus supportive systems? How important in marathon running is state of central nervous system? Not that important, to be honest. So in marathon running, the primary components that will determine their performance will be connection between cardiopulmonary system and the muscle, right?
Right.
So there's very little. So all the other systems will be supportive systems, hormonal, nervous system. Of course, they are important. Nobody claiming they are not. I'm just saying the primary component of performance is if you have a huge heart that can, with huge cardiac output, you have highly oxidative muscular tissues, maybe 95% or higher, right?
Mm-hmm.
So suddenly you can perform very well despite some fatigue in other systems.
Right.
So when we talk about readiness, let's talk on the macro level. So we need to understand readiness is also can be affected by so many different components. It can change based on your molecules, cells. So, but that's a micro component of it. So when we talk about readiness, I prefer to talk about macro level. So instead of molecules, cells, chemical processes, I like to talk about more because that's what we can measure. It's much harder to measure those micro components. But macro components, we talk about the overall systemic level, right? So we're talking about nervous system, hormonal system, cardiopulmonary system, and muscular system. That's the four primary components of, I would say, that we can measure easily, non-invasively, non-stressfully for readiness. So, and changes in those components, of course, will be the changes we need to monitor to understand how ready any athlete is to display their preparedness level. Of course, energy system we also can discuss, but that's a little bit outside these primary systems.
Right. Right. So then, how could a coach, when you look at that, like how you just said the marathon runner. So how do you sit there and break down looking at athletes, like what systems may be more important, or do you just look at it as that's just general physiology and that's something that we should be able to do because of?
Well, of course, everything is general physiology, but let's discuss that a little bit. It's more kind of complicated concept that people realize. The normal scale that at least Western coaches are familiar with when we try to place each sport on certain scale, that is normally defined and everybody familiar with that. So, for example, on one side of the scale we have speed, on the other side of the scale we have strength, right? On the middle we have combination of speed and strength, which is explosive power, and everybody tries to squeeze their sport on this scale. Correct? You're familiar with that scale, right?
Yeah.
So, but that's oriented by quality, output. And quite often, if we orient ourselves on output, it's not the ideal classification. To me, the ideal classification is by their biological systems. And I'll explain in a little bit later why. So when we classify people by functional systems, it's a completely different concept. So first, do I need to give definition of what functional system is? I don't want people to confuse functional training, which is trend right now, and the actual term functional system.
Yeah, let's do that.
Because this is additional problem we're facing in the Western world, that we quite often using terms that are already occupied in science, but we use them for different purposes. And that creates a lots of misunderstanding. So actually in one of the meetings I was present where we had discussions between medical staff, scientific staff, and performance professionals. The very apparent thing was to me is very apparent. So when scientists spoke, it was very, very clear, because what they say is cast in stone. The definitions are definitions and are definitions. When medical staff spoke, it was very clear, because you could not assign any other interpretation of what they are saying other than the what language they use, right? It's a medical terminology.
Mm-hmm.
It's a scientific terminologies. When performance specialists were speaking, you quite often don't understand at all what the hell they're talking about, because what they say and what they mean can be different in different performance specialists' head. There was no underlying terminology. So it's a big problem when we actually try to incorporate science, knowledge of science into the methodology of training, because first we need to at least agree on what the terminology means. So when I say functional system, I mean exactly what we wrote about it. It's a dynamic self-regulating structure of biological components that work in unison to achieve useful adaptive results.
Yep.
Is it hard to process?
No.
It's basically a combination of biological systems working together to achieve one useful result.
Right.
So that's why for marathon runners, the most useful development will be development of their cardiac or changes in their cardiac system and the muscular system. For sprinter, it will be changes in their nervous system or neuromuscular system as a primary, right, components. Of
Mm-hmm.
course, all the other components need to be improved and play supportive role. In some sports, it can be sensory motor component, and functional system is built around sensory motor core, and so on.
Right.
So that's why when we talk about readiness, we need to clearly understand what are the primary components in your sport or in your functional system for given sport, and pay primary primary attention to those components. Good example would be heart rate variability is good method. Everybody going crazy about heart rate variability. But if I measure heart rate variability, let's say in elite explosive athletes, it may not be a good indicator for me at all, right?
Mm-hmm.
How many athletes you know where heart rate variability is always optimal in their state? Basically, the better developed athlete is, the less fluctuations you will find in their heart rate variability. So if athletes less developed, then we can see very significant changes in heart rate variability. But in very, very well properly developed athletes with properly developed functional systems, heart rate variability doesn't change that much. It's constantly on the same level. So for them, identification of readiness, to identify readiness, this method will be not very effective. Then we need to look at other methods, either measure, depending on the type of sport they are in, either measure their sensory motor processes or measure their, let's say, like in some sport, in the explosive sports, maybe a function of central nervous system, because that's what becoming limiting factor, primary. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So there's no one answer to your question, what parameters. It depends on what type of functional system you're trying to build.
100%. Now, going back though too, I guess we're probably on a little bit of a different page here. Looking at HRV, I think that one thing people confuse the most with it is that higher is always better. Like a greater number when they're just looking at that is always better. And I think that
Yeah,
that's a spot too where we look at it that I think people kind of miss the boat on a little bit.
yeah, I hear you. I see that problem quite often myself. Well, we need to understand a very simple concept. And this concept, let's go from medicine. because let's discuss simple things: normal, abnormal, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because medicine always deals with those primary simple concepts: normal, abnormal. So heart rate variability actually a method that analyzes heart rhythm, correct?
Right.
Okay, so let's then use medical knowledge about heart rhythm. So what considered normal in medical field and what considered abnormal? So the normal in medical field considered sinus arrhythmia, right? Or
Mm-hmm.
what simple term for it is breathing arrhythmia. Do I need to explain what it is? Probably not.
Yeah, no.
Everybody knows what sinus arrhythmia.
Right.
So that would be desired normal state for cardiac rhythm according to medical terminology. Now let's start talking about abnormalities in the cardiac rhythms, right?
Mm-hmm.
On one side, when your sympathetic system becomes more and more dominant, this sinus rhythm start changing into stable rhythm, where is less variation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then rigid rhythm, which is very little variation at all. So we already know that moving from that sinus rhythm to on the sympathetic side toward the rigidity is moving into abnormal state. But now it can also happen on the parasympathetic side, as the sympathetic regulation is withdrawal and you start getting more and more parasympathetic influences. We also move away from that sinus rhythm gets disturbed. It goes into what called parasympathetic arrhythmia, where we don't observe that nice sinus rhythm anymore, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, therefore, by medical standard, it would be considered abnormal. It would qualify as arrhythmia, even though at that stage, the parasympathetic system is very, very high. In fact, it's primary dominant system that controls cardiac activity.
Right.
Did I answer your question?
Yeah,
Or
no, 100%. Because you're still now looking at when that parasympathetic activity is that high, your HRV is going to be extremely high. But if you don't know
but
that,
there is no sinus rhythm,
right,
and that's what considered norm. Yes, the parasympathetic, high parasympathetic is good as long it still produces sinus rhythm. If it's too high when sinus rhythm is not present anymore, it's not good anymore.
right. And now you're looking at detriments to not just performance but health as well.
Absolutely,
Right.
absolutely.
Right. So now, Val, let's touch on something here to close it out, man. So we're looking at all the functional systems. We've identified some things. Now, where, when it comes to actually building these athletes, when you're talking with these people and you're listening to these different groups, where, if any, do you see any parts of training that may be overlooked or overdone when you're talking about people in the Western world?
Well, the biggest problem, honestly, it's funny you ask that. There is so many great coaches out there, and there is so many different ways to success. I wouldn't say I don't want to go into detail, tell you what they're doing wrong. Let's start because we need to start from a kind of 1,000 feet view first before we start drilling down into details. What I observed and what I think is the most problem we're facing. And it's not only in Western world. Nowadays, it appears to be all over the world. So there's two ways of how we can make our decisions, right? Because this very simple thing. When we talk about training, coach need to be able, in the best possible way, answer following questions. Why, right?
Mm-hmm.
what,
Yep.
when, how much, and how hard.
Right.
So each answer to it requires certain level of knowledge. How do we obtain this knowledge? So as of right now, when we look at most of the coaches, I'm not saying all, there is great number of exceptions, but I'm talking most. They using, do you understand the difference between inductive way of thinking and deductive way of thinking?
Yes.
Okay, so most of the coaches use an inductive way of thinking. For example, there is in the field, there is very many knowledge-based organizations, individual coaches, and so on. So what these coaches do, they read lots of articles, they read lots of textbooks, they look on the internet what's happening, and if they use inductive system, they say, okay, look, these 5 coaches, the primary knowledge bearers, telling me that weightlifting is good for my athletes, right?
Right.
So inductively, I make a connection that I need to do weightlifting because it's inductive. And it appears to be true because everybody's saying, but then suddenly there is somebody outside of that group. Let's say, in fact, you were meeting with Arsenal today, right?
Yeah, I talked with.
Okay. Arsenal is well known, at least before, I don't know now, where they did not use too much weightlifting at all. And yet they showed very good performance. So suddenly that conclusion that you came to by inductive reasoning, by looking what else everybody's saying, is fallible.
Right.
So the proper way of making decision is deductive way. And there's whole reasons and logics how to work in deductive ways. For example, the deductive coach would come to that conclusion, okay, not just that weightlifting is good, right? Deductively, I can come to conclusion, why is it good? What type of biological adaptations it allows me to produce in my athlete? And then deductive coach can say, do I need to do weightlifting? Or I can produce these type of adaptations by other means. So the difference between inductive and deductive people have a very strong system of thinking in their head. And it's actually, we call it, or in our opinion, we call it physiological intelligence, right? So that system, you compare all of that information in the free domain, you go take it through this system of thinking. So that way, deductively, you can decide not just what these people are doing, but why what they are doing creates a benefit for your athlete. So suddenly you are a lot better at not just following somebody's advice, but comparing it to your own created system of thinking. You choose, this is valid, this is not valid. This is valid, this is not valid. You know what I'm talking about?
100%.
Very good example. Lately, I read more and more on, let's say, speed and power development, right?
Right.
And if I read most of the articles that measure the precise curves of weightlifting application, came to conclusion that the primary way to develop speed and power is 85% of 1 rep max with certain velocity, and you have to do certain amount of repetitions, because if power production decreases during your acute exercise bout, you have to stop, and so on. You are familiar, I'm pretty
Correct.
sure, with that, right?
Yes.
If I'm working with sprinters and I looked inductively in all of these articles, I say, oh, I don't need any type of other weightlifting because they're not contributing to my speed and power development. So I'm going now to stick with this program only. Correct?
Correct.
Now, but if you have a different model of what you need to create as a biological system in your head, and you compare everything to that, you say that's true. Okay, so for actual output, that would be absolutely true. But what about concept of thresholds? Do you understand concept of thresholds?
Yes.
For example, I'm not talking about heart rate thresholds or any of that stuff. I'm talking about we biologically have system of thresholds built in our body that we cannot exceed. So a muscular system, nervous system, all of these systems have certain limitations, and those limitations called threshold. If you step over, first of all, your body not capable of even step over that threshold, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, but if you're trying to create the athlete that performs at the huge margin like of their abilities, right? You need to move them above those thresholds. Correct?
Correct.
You need to teach their system, their biological system, how to push that threshold much further and still operate without breaking down, right? Because everybody can step over threshold, but you will break down before you know.
Right.
So, well, in some cases, you can't even step over that threshold. In that case, weightlifting with 1 rep max and actually failure where you can't lift it and you need to have assistance is a very good way to teach your nervous system to step over that neuromuscular threshold. Even though it might not directly affect your speed and power production. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
It has a different benefit.
Right.
So if you use an inductive system, you will come to a conclusion, I'm going to eliminate any other weightlifting than the ones that directly produces this type of, speed and power improvements. But if you have system of thinking, you think, but that's not enough. Now I need to push this organism over, like extend their threshold level in neuromuscular function. And there, 1 rep max can be quite beneficial. So I think, and this is what we should probably be doing, actually helping people to understand or create that system of thinking in their heads, right?
Right.
That they can, it will be between them and all the information out there in the free domain. So they can apply this knowledge, apply this system of thinking to separate what's true, because true and always true is 2 different things, right?
Yes.
So, for example, logically we can say, well, what's the all humans are apes. That's true, but it's not always true, because not all apes are humans. That's always true. So this is the system, I think, that is lacking, the system of thinking that really to see step forward in coach. And I think we need to create that system of thinking.
I love it. I think that's awesome. I think that the one thing that we can always do is challenge ourselves to be better and think better and find better ways. And Val, I couldn't have said it better myself, my man. I love it. I think that's the inductive versus deductive. I think is a fantastic, perfect idea, and I think that's a great spot to end it on, brother. I can't thank you enough for spending the time with us today. This is absolutely fantastic. People are going to love it, my man.
Okay. Well, and good luck with that.
Yeah. Val, thank you so much, buddy. We'll be in touch real soon.
Okay, talk to you
Thanks.
soon.
Yep.
Bye.
And a huge thanks to Val Nasedkin for taking the time and talking with us today. Guys, Val is always open, candid, honest, absolutely fantastic. You know, the whole idea of thinking, changing how we're thinking to look at what we're doing to better prescribe what we're doing for the athlete, right? I mean, just absolutely fantastic stuff right there. Thinking about, you know, what the adaptation that we need to occur for that athlete to perform better, and then prescribing based upon that are some things that really are eye-opening and really should open our minds to new ideas as to what we're doing with our program with our athletes. Can't thank Val enough for being so open, honest, and candid with us today. Absolutely fantastic stuff. And as always, guys, if you enjoyed the talk, please share it through the social media outlet of your choice: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, whatever it may be. Just trying to spread the word, guys. Trying to get great information out to all the great coaches out there. So if you wouldn't mind passing it on, we would greatly appreciate it. And if you got 2 seconds and could leave us a review on iTunes, we would greatly appreciate that as well. And as always, guys, thank you for everything you do for us here at Central Virginia Sport Performance. We will be back next week with another awesome guest. We will see you then.